Mrs. Brennan? I'm so sorry. I think there's been a mix-up with our records. When I spoke to your husband last week about renewing the lease, he mentioned, well, I assumed he'd discussed it with you. The woman's voice on the phone was apologetic, confused, professional. Cassidy Brennan stood in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows she'd cleaned that morning, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. I'm sorry, Cassidy said, her voice steady in a way that surprised her. Which property are we talking about? The apartment downtown, the one-bedroom on 7th Street. He's been a tenant for, let me check, 4 years now. The lease renews next month and there was a question about the parking space allocation. 4 years. Cassidy thanked the woman. Ended the call. Set her phone on the counter with careful precision. Then she stood very still in the kitchen of the house she'd maintained for 17 years and realized she had no idea who she was married to. She didn't call Joel. That was the first decision Cassidy made, and it felt significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate yet. For 17 years, her instinct when something confused or upset her had been to bring it to Joel, to let him explain, to trust his version of reality over her own uncertain perceptions. Not this time. This time, Cassidy sat down at the desk in the small home office. The room Joel used maybe twice a year, the room that was nominally hers but felt like every other space in the house, a place she occupied without truly inhabiting. And she looked at their joint bank account. She'd managed their household finances for years. Paid bills, tracked expenses, handled the practical mechanics of their financial life while Joel focused on the larger strategy, investments, retirement planning, the architecture of their future security. It had seemed like a reasonable division of labor. Now, Cassidy looked at the statements with different eyes, and she saw it. Monthly withdrawals, always in cash. Amounts large enough to matter but small enough not to trigger alarm. Payments to vendor names she didn't recognize. Charges categorized as business expenses that, now that she was actually looking, formed a pattern of something else entirely. 4 years of financial choreography, hidden in plain sight. Cassidy had built a career in consulting before marriage. She knew how to read data. She knew how to identify patterns buried in noise. She'd been exceptional at it once, at seeing what others missed, at connecting information into narratives that revealed operational truth. She'd forgotten she knew how to do this. Or maybe she'd just stopped letting herself look. When Joel came home that evening, Cassidy was cooking dinner. She heard his key in the lock, his footsteps in the entryway, the soft thud of his briefcase hitting the bench by the door. The same sounds that had marked the end of countless days, the rhythm of a marriage so familiar it had become invisible. Something smells good, Joel said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. He loosened his tie, ran a hand through graying hair, smiled at her in that distracted way that meant he was still partially elsewhere, still thinking about work or email or whatever occupied the space in his mind that Cassidy had long ago stopped believing she could access. He crossed to her, kissed her cheek. The gesture was automatic, affectionate in the way long-married couples are affectionate, more habit than intention, more ritual than feeling. "How was your day?" he asked. Cassidy looked at her husband. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Joel was 52, handsome in a way that had settled comfortably into middle age. Successful. Well, regarded in his field. The kind of man people described as accomplished, driven, someone who had built something significant through intelligence and relentless focus. Standing 3 feet away from her, asking about her day with polite disinterest while marinara sauce simmered on the stove, he was also a complete stranger. "Fine," Cassidy said. "Quiet. How was yours?" Joel launched into a story about a difficult client meeting, a colleague who had mishandled something important, the constant frustration of working with people who didn't share his standards. Cassidy had heard variations of this story 1,000 times. She made appropriate listening sounds, stirred the sauce, set the table while Joel talked. She watched him and thought, "You have an apartment I've never seen. You've been living a life I know nothing about. And you're standing in our kitchen complaining about your coworkers' incompetence like this is a normal Tuesday." The dissonance was so profound it felt almost surreal. "You okay?" Joel asked, pausing mid-sentence. "You seem distracted." For one crystalline moment, Cassidy considered telling him, asking directly, "Do you have an apartment downtown? Have you been lying to me for 4 years?" But something stopped her. Maybe it was the knowledge that asking Joel would only give him time to construct an explanation. to reshape the narrative in ways that would make Cassidy doubt what she knew. Maybe it was the understanding that after 17 years of having her perceptions gently corrected, her memories revised, her reality translated into Joel's preferred version, she couldn't trust any answer he gave her. Or maybe it was something simpler. For the first time in their marriage, Cassidy knew something Joel didn't know she knew. And that asymmetry felt like power. "I'm fine," Cassidy said, "just tired." Joel accepted this without question. Of course he did. He'd always accepted Cassidy's surface explanations, had never been particularly interested in excavating her deeper emotional life. She'd told herself for years that this was just his personality, that some people were naturally more curious about internal experience and others weren't. Now she wondered if he'd simply never cared enough to dig. They ate dinner. Joel talked about an upcoming business trip, asked if Cassidy minded if he played golf that weekend with colleagues, mentioned he'd be working late several nights next week. The same requests he'd been making for years, the same accommodations Cassidy had been granting without hesitation. She said yes to all of it, smiled, cleared the dishes. And when Joel went upstairs to his laptop in the home office that was actually his, the space with the door that closed, the room Cassidy had learned not to disturb, she sat alone in the living room and felt something crack open inside her chest. Cassidy waited until Joel was asleep. Then she went to his study, opened his laptop, password still her birthday, which now felt less like sentiment and more like carelessness, and found his email. She searched for the property management company's name. The correspondence was extensive. Lease agreements, renewal confirmations, maintenance requests for an apartment Cassidy had never heard of until 8 hours ago. The apartment had been leased in Joel's name only. 1 bedroom, updated kitchen, parking space included. The kind of place a young professional might rent, not the kind of place a married man in his 50s needed for anything Cassidy could think of that was innocent. She searched his sent folder for the address. Found references to meeting someone there. Emails coordinating times, making plans. No names, Joel was too careful for that, but the subtext was unmistakable. "I can't wait to see you. Last weekend was perfect. You make me feel like myself again." Cassidy read that last line 3 times. "You make me feel like myself again." Which meant what exactly? That with Cassidy, Joel felt like someone else? Someone he didn't want to be? Someone whose real self required a secret apartment and a hidden life to emerge? She thought about the version of Joel she lived with. Responsible, hardworking, occasionally affectionate in that distant way, perpetually focused on career advancement and long-term planning. A man who needed order, quiet, a home life that functioned smoothly so he could direct his energy elsewhere. She thought about the version of Joel in these emails. Playful, spontaneous, emotionally available in ways he had never been with her. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like nausea, that she had spent 17 years accommodating a man who was saving his best self for someone else. The next 72 hours passed in a strange duality. On the surface, Cassidy continued performing her role. She made coffee in the morning, asked Joel about his meetings, managed the household logistics that allowed their life to function seamlessly. She smiled when appropriate, listened when required, moved through their shared space like water, present but unobtrusive, exactly as she'd learned to be. But underneath, Cassidy was somewhere else entirely. She was in Joel's email, reading years of correspondence. She was in their bank records, tracing patterns of secret spending. She was piecing together the architecture of a life Joel had built parallel to theirs, a life she'd funded without knowing it, a life that had existed in the negative space of every business trip, every late night at the office, every weekend Joel had needed to himself. The evidence was overwhelming once she knew where to look. Restaurant receipts for places they'd never been together, hotel charges on weekends Joel claimed to be at conferences, purchases from shops Cassidy didn't recognize, clothing, jewelry, wine that had never appeared in their home. 4 years of meticulous deception camouflaged as business expenses and professional obligations. Cassidy had always believed Joel when he said his career was demanding, that his work required travel and long hours and flexibility she couldn't quite understand because she'd stepped away from professional life. She'd accepted that his world was complex and high pressure, that her role was to provide the stable foundation that allowed him to navigate that world effectively. She'd been a fool. No, that wasn't quite right. Cassidy had been someone who trusted her husband, who believed the story he told about their life. who had no reason to suspect that the man she'd built 17 years with was also building something else entirely, somewhere she couldn't see. The betrayal wasn't just the apartment or the affair or whoever Joel was meeting there. The betrayal was that every time Cassidy had made herself smaller to accommodate Joel's needs, every career opportunity she'd declined, every friendship she'd let fade, every piece of herself she'd edited away to be the wife he required. It had been based on false information. Joel hadn't needed her sacrifice. He'd had abundant time and energy and emotional capacity. He'd simply chosen to spend it elsewhere. On the third day, Joel mentioned he'd be traveling the following week. "Conference in Atlanta," he said over breakfast, scrolling through his phone. "I'll be gone Tuesday through Friday. You going to be okay here alone?" It was the same question he always asked, and Cassidy had always found it vaguely patronizing, as if 4 days alone was some kind of hardship she might not manage. Now she heard it differently. Now it sounded like Joel checking that the house, the base he operated from, would be maintained in his absence. That when he returned from whatever he was actually doing in Atlanta, everything would be exactly as he'd left it. "I'll be fine," Cassidy said. Joel nodded, already mentally elsewhere. "I might extend it through the weekend if the sessions run long. I'll let you know." Which meant, Cassidy translated, that he'd already planned to extend it. That the conference was probably real but had been selected specifically because it provided cover for something else. That Joel would spend his days in professional development sessions, and his nights doing whatever he did in the life Cassidy wasn't part of. She wondered if he took whoever she was on these trips. If the apartment downtown was just the local version of something much larger. If Cassidy's entire marriage had been the part-time arrangement while Joel's real life happened in all the spaces she wasn't. "Sounds good," Cassidy said. She watched Joel register her easy agreement. For 17 years she'd responded to his travel announcements with some variation of disappointment. Not dramatic, just a quiet sadness that he'd be gone, a mild request that he call when he could, a resigned acceptance that his career came first. She'd performed the role of wife who missed him, who would wait patiently, who understood the sacrifice was necessary. This time she'd said "sounds good" like he'd announced he was picking up groceries. Joel looked at her for a moment, something almost like confusion crossing his features. Then his phone buzzed and he returned his attention to the screen, and the moment passed. But Cassidy had seen it. The flicker of uncertainty, the brief disruption in Joel's narrative where her behavior didn't quite match his expectations of who she was. Good. Let him be uncertain. Let him wonder just for a second if the wife he'd stopped really seeing was still the person he thought she was. When Joel left for the airport Tuesday morning, Cassidy kissed him goodbye with the same distracted affection she'd been offering for years. She waved from the doorway, watched his car disappear down the street. Then she went back inside their house and started excavating her past. She pulled boxes from the back of closets, boxes she hadn't opened in years, boxes containing artifacts from the woman she'd been before marriage, old journals, work portfolios, photographs from a version of her life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Cassidy spread it all across the dining room table and tried to remember who she'd been at 28. The journals were revelatory. Page after page of ambitions, plans, excitement about projects and clients, and the intricate puzzle-solving of strategic consulting. She'd loved her work. She'd been exceptional at it. Every performance review in her portfolio confirmed it. Brilliant, analytical, mind, creative problem, solver, natural leadership presence. When had she stopped being that person? Cassidy traced the timeline. She'd met Joel at 29, married him at 30. Kept working for the first 2 years of marriage, then gradually scaled back as they moved for Joel's career advancement. She'd told herself it was temporary, that she'd read him to consulting once they were settled. But they'd never settled. There had always been one more move, one more transition, one more phase where Joel's career demanded focus and Cassidy's ambitions could wait. By 35, she'd stopped working entirely. By 40, she'd stopped mentioning that she used to work at all. And now, at 45, she sometimes forgot she'd ever been anything other than Joel's wife. Cassidy found an email exchange from 9 years ago, back when she still had active contact with former colleagues. A consulting firm had reached out about a senior strategy role. The position was perfect for her experience. The work was exactly what she loved. It would require travel, irregular hours, the kind of professional intensity that had once energized her completely. She'd forwarded the opportunity to Joel, excited to discuss it. His response had been careful, loving, concerned. He'd pointed out that the role would be stressful, that they'd worked hard to build a life with better balance, that they'd talked about starting a family soon and this timing seemed complicated, that he worried about her taking on something so demanding when she'd seemed much happier since stepping back from the intensity of consulting. Cassidy stared at that email and tried to remember the conversation that followed. She had a vague recollection of Joel's worried face, his gentle questions about whether she was feeling unfulfilled, his suggestion that maybe she was romanticizing work she'd actually found exhausting. She remembered doubt creeping in. Had she loved consulting, or just the validation it provided? Was she chasing professional achievement because she genuinely wanted it, or because she'd internalized cultural messaging about women needing careers to matter? She'd turned down the position. They'd never started a family. That conversation had happened again a year later, and somehow the conclusion had been that Joel's career couldn't absorb the disruption of children, that their life was full and satisfying as it was, that Cassidy had never felt a powerful biological pull toward motherhood anyway. All of which was true, or had seemed true, or had become true through Joel's consistent framing until Cassidy couldn't distinguish between her authentic feelings and the narrative Joel had constructed about who she was. She sat surrounded by evidence of her former self, journals filled with strategic thinking, photographs showing someone confident and engaged, performance reviews documenting excellence, and realized she'd let Joel convince her that woman had never really existed, that the tired, professionally unfulfilled version Cassidy had been playing for years was her authentic self, and the ambitious consultant was just a phase of striving she'd matured past. But holding her own journals, reading her own words, Cassidy knew the truth. She'd been edited, revised, rewritten into a character that fit more comfortably into Joel's life story. And she'd been so accommodating, so eager to be the wife he needed, that she'd participated in her own erasure. Thursday afternoon, Cassidy drove downtown to the address from the lease agreement. She didn't know what she expected to find. The rational part of her understood she wouldn't learn anything useful from staring at a building, but something pulled her there anyway. Some need to make the abstract betrayal concrete, to see with her own eyes the place where Joel's secret life happened. The building was sleek, modern. Young professionals moved in and out carrying yoga mats, messenger bags, coffee cups. This was the kind of neighborhood where people built urban lives, close to restaurants and galleries and the energy of city center. Not where middle-aged married men maintained secret apartments, except, apparently it was. Cassidy sat in her car across the street, feeling ridiculous and slightly unhinged. What was she doing here? What did she think this accomplished? She was about to leave when someone caught her attention. A woman, early 30s, exiting the building. Blonde, athletic, carrying herself with the easy confidence of someone whose life was working exactly as planned. She got into a car parked near the entrance, a nice car but not extravagant. Young, professional, successful, not wealthy. Cassidy had no idea if this woman had any connection to Joel. Probably didn't. The building likely had 50 units, and statistically this person was almost certainly a complete stranger living her own life with no awareness of Cassidy's unraveling marriage. But watching her drive away, Cassidy understood something that made her chest hurt. Whoever Joel met at that apartment, whoever received the version of him that was playful and spontaneous and emotionally available, she got something Cassidy had spent 17 years trying to earn and never quite achieving. She got Joel's attention, his best self, the parts of him that weren't tired or distracted or perpetually focused on something else. And that woman, whoever she was, probably didn't have to edit herself to receive those things. Probably didn't have to make herself smaller or quieter or more accommodating. Probably was loved precisely as she was, in the moment, without the weight of domestic obligation and long-term partnership grinding everything into exhausted routine. Cassidy had spent 17 years being the foundation, the steady ground, the wife who understood and supported and waited patiently for the day when Joel's career would stabilize enough that he could finally focus on them. And Joel had spent 4 years, at least, building something else entirely with someone who didn't require any of that patient sacrifice. She drove home and understood with absolute clarity that she couldn't ask Joel about the apartment, because asking Joel would mean entering a conversation where his version of reality would compete with hers, and Cassidy had spent so many years learning to defer to his superior certainty that she would lose. He would reframe the apartment as something innocent, a workspace, an investment property, a place he went to think. He would make her feel paranoid for questioning, insecure for doubting, unreasonable for being hurt. He would edit her reality again, and this time she wouldn't be able to trust herself enough to resist. So Cassidy wouldn't ask. She would sit with what she knew. She would investigate further. She would rebuild her capacity to trust her own perceptions, and she would decide what to do with this information on her own terms, without Joel's narrative shaping her understanding of her own life. Joel returned from Atlanta Sunday evening. He seemed relaxed, energized, kissed Cassidy hello and told her about the conference sessions, the networking dinners, the colleague who'd been insufferable during a panel discussion. He seemed genuinely happy to be home. Cassidy listened and wondered which parts were true. She wondered if Joel had actually attended every session he described, or if some of those hours had been spent elsewhere. She wondered if the colleague really had been insufferable, or if that was just color added to make the story more believable. She wondered if Joel kept the lies straight in his own mind, or if he'd been doing this so long that fabrication and truth had blurred together into something indistinguishable. "I missed you," Joel said, pulling her into a hug. Had he? Or was that just something he said because it was what husbands said after trips, the expected line in the script of marriage? Cassidy hugged him back and felt nothing. That was new. For 17 years she'd felt something when Joel touched her, not always passion or even particular warmth, but connection, familiarity, the comfort of long partnership. She'd built a life with this man. That meant something, even when it wasn't exciting. Now, standing in his arms, she felt like she was embracing a stranger. Or worse, like she was embracing a fictional character. And somewhere outside her awareness, the real Joel was living a life she had no access to. "I missed you too," Cassidy said. The lie came easily. She'd been lying for days now, lying by omission, lying by performance, lying by continuing to play the role of Joel's accommodating wife when internally she'd already left the marriage. Turnabout, she supposed, was fair play. The breaking point came Tuesday morning. Cassidy was doing laundry, Joel's shirts from the Atlanta trip. She checked pockets before washing, habitual and mindless, and found a receipt. Dinner for 2. Saturday night? A restaurant she'd never heard of. Not in Atlanta. In a city 2 hours north of where they lived. Cassidy stood in the laundry room holding the receipt and felt something fundamental shift. Joel hadn't been in Atlanta all weekend. Or he'd been in Atlanta for the conference and then gone somewhere else. Somewhere he'd had dinner for 2 at an expensive restaurant, while Cassidy was home alone believing he was still at professional development sessions. The lies were so layered, so comprehensive, that she couldn't track them anymore. And she was done trying. Cassidy called the number Wednesday morning. The law office answered on the second ring. Professional, warm. She asked to schedule a consultation for a family law matter. They had availability Friday at 10. She took it. She didn't tell Joel she had plans Friday morning. He didn't ask. He'd stopped tracking her schedule years ago, had stopped being curious about how she spent her days. She was simply there when he needed her and invisible when he didn't. Friday morning, Cassidy dressed carefully. Not for Joel, he'd already left for the office, but for herself. She wanted to look competent, serious, like someone whose life hadn't just imploded. She drove to the address downtown, parked, walked into a building that smelled like expensive carpet and filtered air, took the elevator to the 4th floor. The receptionist smiled at her. "Mrs. Brennan? Margaret is ready for you." Margaret Reeves was 56, with steel gray hair cut sharp and eyes that missed nothing. She invited Cassidy into an office with windows overlooking the city and closed the door. Gestured to a chair. Sat across from her with a legal pad and an expression of professional compassion. "Tell me what's happening," Margaret said. And Cassidy, who had spent 17 years learning not to speak difficult truths, who had trained herself to minimize and accommodate and translate her pain into understanding. Cassidy told her everything. She told her about the phone call, the apartment, the 4 years of hidden expenses, the emails suggesting another relationship, the receipt from last weekend proving Joel hadn't been where he said he was, the comprehensive, meticulous deception woven through their entire marriage. Margaret listened without interrupting. Took notes. When Cassidy finally stopped talking, Margaret set down her pen and looked at her with something like recognition. "Does your husband know you're aware of any of this?" Margaret asked. "No." "Have you confronted him?" "No." "Why not?" Cassidy hesitated, trying to articulate something she'd only recently understood herself. Because if I ask him about it, he'll tell me his version. And he's very good at telling his version. He spent 17 years convincing me that my perceptions are wrong, my memories are faulty, my feelings are overreactions. If I confront him without being prepared, I'll end up apologizing for doubting him. I know how that sounds, but... It sounds, Margaret said quietly, like you've been gaslit for a very long time. The word landed like a physical blow. Cassidy had thought about manipulation, about narrative control, about Joel's tendency to reframe her reality. But gaslit felt like naming something she'd been dancing around without quite seeing directly. I want a divorce, Cassidy heard herself say. I want out of this marriage. And I want it done in a way where he can't rewrite what happened, where I don't end up somehow being the villain of the story he tells. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a kind of professional engagement, like Cassidy had just said the exact right thing. Then we need to be strategic, Margaret said. Your husband doesn't know you're aware of the apartment, the hidden spending, any of it. That's leverage, but it's only leverage if we use it correctly. She walked Cassidy through the next steps. Document everything, the apartment lease, the financial records, the emails if Cassidy could access them legally. Open a bank account in her name only. Secure copies of all important documents. Build a comprehensive record before confronting Joel or filing anything official. The goal, Margaret explained, is to ensure that when this becomes public, when you file for divorce and this gets real, you have evidence he can't dismiss or explain away. You protect yourself legally, financially, and narratively. Narratively. Cassidy felt something unlock in her chest. For 17 years, Joel had controlled the narrative of their marriage. He determined which version of events was official, which memories were accurate, which interpretation of their relationship was true. But Cassidy was taking that power back. She was gathering her own evidence, forming her own understanding, preparing to tell her own story. And Joel didn't even know it was happening. Over the next 2 weeks, Cassidy became someone she hadn't been in years. Methodical, strategic, clear-headed. She photographed documents, downloaded bank statements, created encrypted files of emails and receipts, opened a checking account at a bank Joel didn't use and transferred money from their joint savings. Not enough to trigger attention, just enough to ensure she had independent resources. She did this all calmly, without drama, while continuing to perform her role as Joel's wife. She made his coffee, asked about his meetings, listened to his complaints about work stress, made dinner, managed the house, smiled when appropriate. And internally, she was somewhere else entirely. She was remembering who she'd been before she learned to accommodate Joel's reality. She was reconnecting with the woman who'd built a consulting career through strategic thinking and pattern recognition. She was reclaiming skills she'd turned inward for years, skills she'd used to justify Joel's behavior and explain away her doubts instead of investigating them. Now those skills had a different target, protecting herself. Margaret checked in twice, asked how Cassidy was holding up, whether Joel suspected anything. He didn't. Of course he didn't. Joel had stopped really looking at Cassidy years ago. She was furniture in his life, functional, expected, unexamined. The idea that she might be planning something, thinking strategically, operating with her own agenda, it would never occur to him. His certainty that she was exactly who he believed her to be was the weakness Cassidy would exploit. Not for revenge, not to hurt him, just to free herself. 3 weeks after the phone call that shattered everything, Cassidy sat in her car outside Joel's secret apartment building and felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no desperate need to understand why or how or what she'd done wrong. Just clarity. The marriage she'd believed in had never existed. The man she'd been devoted to was largely fictional, a character Joel performed at home while living his authentic life elsewhere. The sacrifices she'd made had been based on false information. The identity she'd built as Joel's supportive wife was constructed on lies. None of that was her failure. It was just the truth she finally had access to. Cassidy started the car and drove away from the building without looking back. She had work to do, evidence to organize, documents to secure, a life to plan that didn't include the man who'd spent 17 years treating her devotion like an inexhaustible resource he could mine without consequence. Joel thought he was in control, thought his secrets were safe, thought Cassidy would continue being the patient, understanding wife who asked for nothing and forgave everything. He was wrong. And by the time Joel realized how wrong he was, Cassidy would be ready. Not with rage, not with spectacle, not with the kind of dramatic confrontation that would let him reframe her as emotional or unstable or unreasonable, but with something more powerful: information, preparation, and the calm certainty of someone who had finally stopped editing herself to fit someone else's story. The phone call had exposed everything. Now Cassidy was going to reclaim everything, starting with herself. The consulting work started with a single email. Cassidy had spent an entire evening debating whether to send it. Sitting at her laptop while Joel watched television in the other room, she'd typed and deleted the message 6 times before finally hitting send at 11:30 at night. The recipient was Emma Khalil, a former colleague from Cassidy's consulting days. They'd worked together on a major healthcare system reorganization 12 years ago. Emma had been brilliant then, sharp and strategic in ways that had challenged Cassidy to think more creatively. They'd kept in loose touch for a few years after Cassidy left the firm, then gradually drifted into the category of people who liked each other's social media posts but never actually spoke. The email was simple. Cassidy said she was considering returning to consulting work after a long break. She wondered if Emma had time for coffee, advice, conversation. She tried to sound casual, like this was idle curiosity rather than a drowning woman reaching for something solid. Emma responded within an hour, even though it was nearly midnight. Said she'd love to catch up. Suggested a coffee shop downtown, Thursday at 10, if that worked. Cassidy stared at the response and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Thursday morning, Cassidy told Joel she was meeting a friend for coffee. He barely looked up from his phone, nodded absently, asked if she'd have time to pick up his dry cleaning afterward. She didn't answer directly, just took her keys and left. The coffee shop was the kind of place Cassidy used to frequent in her working days. Exposed brick, good espresso, young professionals hunched over laptops building careers and futures. Walking in felt like stepping into a past life. Emma was already there, waving from a corner table. She stood as Cassidy approached, pulled her into a hug that felt genuinely warm. Then Emma stepped back and really looked at her, and Cassidy saw something flicker across her face. Concern, maybe. Or recognition of something missing. They sat, ordered coffee, spent the first 10 minutes on pleasantries and updates. Emma had left the large consulting firm 7 years ago, started her own boutique practice focused on nonprofit strategy and organizational development. Business was good. Challenging, exhausting, completely fulfilling. Then Emma tilted her head slightly and asked the question that cut through all the polite catching up. "So what's really going on, Cassidy?" And because Cassidy was so tired of performing, so exhausted from maintaining the facade that her life was fine, she told the truth. Not about Joel, not about the apartment or the betrayal or the divorce she was planning, but about the professional emptiness. The years of telling herself that stepping back from consulting had been her choice, her preference, when really she'd just made herself smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left. "I miss the work," Cassidy said. "I miss being good at something that matters. I miss using my brain for more than managing a household that one person could easily manage alone. I miss being seen as competent, I guess. Being recognized for something other than how well I accommodate other people's needs." Emma listened with the focused attention Cassidy remembered from their working relationship. When Cassidy finished, Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have a project that's perfect for you." The opportunity was consulting work for a regional nonprofit network. Strategy development for sustainable funding models. Complex stakeholder management. Exactly the kind of multidimensional problem-solving Cassidy had loved 12 years ago. "It's part-time initially," Emma said. "Maybe 15 hours a week, but there's potential to expand if it goes well. And Cassidy, I remember how you think. You see patterns other people miss. You ask the questions that crack problems open. If you want back in, I want you on my team." Cassidy felt something crack open in her chest. Someone remembered who she'd been. Someone saw the competence she'd spent years burying. Someone was offering her a way back to herself. "Yes," Cassidy said. "Absolutely yes." Emma smiled, pulled out her laptop right there in the coffee shop, and started walking Cassidy through the project scope. And for the first time in 17 years, Cassidy felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She drove home 3 hours later with a consulting contract, a project timeline, and access to the kind of strategic work she'd convinced herself she didn't miss. She'd been lying to herself about that too. When Joel came home that evening, Cassidy was cooking dinner with music playing. Something upbeat, energetic. Not the quiet background music she usually kept low so it wouldn't disturb Joel's concentration. He paused in the doorway, looking vaguely confused by the shift in atmosphere. "Good day?" he asked. "Really good," Cassidy said. She didn't elaborate. Didn't mention the consulting project or Emma, or the fact that she'd just reclaimed a piece of herself Joel had never particularly valued. Just smiled and turned back to the stove. Joel lingered for a moment like he wanted to ask more, then shrugged and went upstairs to change. And Cassidy stood in the kitchen and realized she no longer felt any obligation to share the good things in her life with a man who'd been living a secret life for years. Turnabout, she thought again, was fair play. The consulting work was everything Cassidy had forgotten she was capable of. She dove into the project with intensity that surprised her. Analyzed funding data, interviewed stakeholders, mapped organizational ecosystems. Her brain worked the way it used to work, making connections and identifying leverage points and designing strategies that accounted for human complexity. She was exceptional at this. She'd forgotten, but her clients remembered immediately. The nonprofit director called Emma after Cassidy's first presentation, said Cassidy had identified problems in 15 minutes that their internal team had been struggling with for months, asked if she was available for additional projects. Emma called Cassidy laughing. "I told you, you're still brilliant, you just needed to remember." Cassidy worked from coffee shops, libraries, anywhere that wasn't the house she'd maintained for Joel's comfort. She started dressing differently. Not dramatically, just intentionally. Clothes that made her feel competent rather than invisible. Professional instead of purely functional. She got her hair cut. That was the change that made Joel actually notice. Cassidy had worn her hair long for 17 years. Joel preferred it that way, had mentioned more than once that he found long hair more feminine, more attractive. So Cassidy had kept it long even though maintaining it was time-consuming, and she'd never particularly loved the style. She walked into a salon on impulse one afternoon and asked for something different. Shorter, easier, a cut that framed her face instead of hiding it. The stylist understood immediately what Cassidy was asking for, even if Cassidy herself didn't fully articulate it. She cut Cassidy's hair to just below her shoulders, added layers that gave it movement and life. The woman in the mirror looked sharper, more present, more herself. When Cassidy came home, Joel stared. "You cut your hair." "I did. I liked it long." Cassidy met his eyes and felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no impulse to apologize, no need to explain or justify her choice. "I like it like this," she said. Joel opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, then seemed to think better of it. He nodded slowly, still looking unsettled, and retreated to his office. Cassidy went upstairs and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Really looked, the way she'd started looking at everything in her life since the phone call that changed everything. The woman looking back was still Cassidy Brennan. Still 45, still married, still living in the same house. But something fundamental had shifted. She took up more space now, existed more solidly, moved through the world with the beginning of something that felt like ownership of her own life. She was coming back, not to who she'd been before Joel, but to something truer. Something that integrated the skills she'd developed, the strength she'd built, the clarity that came from having your reality shattered and choosing to rebuild it yourself. Joel noticed the changes but couldn't quite name them. Cassidy stopped asking detailed questions about his day, stopped managing his schedule with the meticulous attention she'd always given it, stopped performing the emotional labor of anticipating his needs and smoothing his path and making herself endlessly available for whatever he required. When Joel mentioned he'd be working late, Cassidy said okay and made dinner plans with Emma. When he complained about a difficult colleague, Cassidy made sympathetic sounds without actually engaging in the problem-solving she used to offer. When he suggested a weekend trip they'd talked about taking, Cassidy said she was busy with a project deadline and couldn't commit to dates yet. Small shifts, subtle withdrawals, nothing dramatic enough to provoke direct confrontation, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Cassidy was present in their marriage the way Joel had been present for years, physically there, functionally cooperative, emotionally elsewhere. One evening, Joel asked directly if something was wrong between them. They were in the living room. Joel had his laptop. Cassidy was reviewing project notes. The question came out tentative, like Joel wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Everything's fine," Cassidy said without looking up. You seem different. Different how? Joel struggled to articulate it. Distant, I guess. Like you're going through the motions but not really here. The irony was so perfect, Cassidy almost laughed. She'd been going through the motions for years, performing the role of devoted wife while feeling increasingly hollow, increasingly erased, increasingly invisible. And Joel had never noticed, had never asked if she was happy or fulfilled or even present in her own life. Now, after 3 weeks of Cassidy pulling back her emotional labor, suddenly he registered that something had changed. I'm here, Cassidy said, meeting his eyes. I'm exactly as here as I've always been. It was technically true. She was exactly as present as she'd been when she was devotedly maintaining their life, while Joel built a secret apartment and a hidden relationship. No more, no less. Joel seemed to hear something in her tone he couldn't quite identify. He looked at her with an expression that was almost uncertain, almost vulnerable. For half a second, Cassidy wondered if this was the moment. If Joel was finally seeing her, finally recognizing that something fundamental had shifted between them. If he might actually ask the deeper question, might create space for the truth that sat between them like a third presence in the room. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and whatever moment had been building dissolved. He returned his attention to his laptop, and Cassidy went back to her notes, unsurprised and no longer disappointed. The social re-entry happened gradually. Cassidy started accepting invitations she would have previously declined. Coffee with acquaintances, a book club she'd dropped out of years ago, a community yoga class Emma had recommended. People noticed the shift. A neighbor commented that it was nice to see Cassidy out more, that she seemed well. An old friend mentioned she'd seemed happier lately, more like her old self. Her old self. Cassidy turned that phrase over in her mind. Which self was that? The consultant she'd been at 28? The devoted wife she'd performed as for 17 years? Or something new entirely, assembled from pieces of both and adding something that belonged only to this moment? She thought maybe it was the last one, a self that integrated everything she'd learned, including the hard lessons about what happened when you edited yourself to fit someone else's story. At a fundraising event for one of Emma's nonprofit clients, Cassidy found herself in conversation with a group discussing organizational change management. Someone asked her opinion on resistance patterns. Cassidy answered with the kind of nuanced, strategic thinking she used to offer routinely in client meetings, and the group went quiet, then engaged fully, asking follow-up questions and building on her framework. Emma watched from across the room with visible satisfaction. Afterward, walking to their cars, Emma said, "You know what I noticed tonight?" "What?" "You didn't diminish yourself once, didn't soften your expertise or defer to anyone or apologize before stating your opinion. You just knew things and said them. It was like watching someone remember their own power." Cassidy felt the observation land somewhere deep. She had spent years apologizing before speaking, framing expertise as suggestions, making herself smaller to avoid threatening anyone's ego. She'd learned that behavior in her marriage, where Joel's certainty always outweighed her knowledge, where expressing confidence in her own perceptions was reframed as stubbornness or insecurity. But tonight, in a room of nonprofit leaders and consultants, she'd just been competent, clear, authoritative without apology, and it had felt like coming home. The breaking point came not because Cassidy planned it, but because Joel made a mistake. He'd been careful for years, meticulous about covering his tracks, managing his parallel lives, ensuring Cassidy never had reason to question his explanations. But people get careless, especially when they believe themselves untouchable. Cassidy found the bank statement on a Tuesday afternoon. Joel had left it on his desk. Normally he was careful about financial documents, shredding anything sensitive, keeping accounts Cassidy didn't monitor locked away from casual view. But this had been left out, visible, maybe because Joel had been rushing to a meeting. It was an account Cassidy had never seen before. The bank name was unfamiliar. The statement showed regular deposits and withdrawals, a pattern of activity suggesting this wasn't dormant or forgotten. Cassidy stood in Joel's office doorway and stared at the envelope on his desk. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't seen it, continue gathering evidence slowly, methodically, the way Margaret had advised. Or she could look. She looked. The account had been opened 6 years ago. Regular monthly deposits, always the same amount. Withdrawals for rent, utilities, insurance. This wasn't hidden money from their joint accounts. This was a completely separate financial life, which meant Joel had income she didn't know about, which meant the financial transparency she'd believed they maintained was another fiction. Cassidy photographed the statement, returned it to exactly where it had been, went downstairs and called Margaret. "I need to accelerate the timeline," Cassidy said when the attorney answered. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep living in his house, playing his wife, pretending everything is normal when I know what I know." Margaret asked what had changed. Cassidy told her about the account, the evidence of financial deception even more comprehensive than they'd initially documented. "Okay," Margaret said. "We have enough, more than enough. If you're ready, we can file." "I'm ready." "Do you want to tell him first? Some people prefer to have the conversation before he's served with papers." Cassidy thought about that. Thought about sitting Joel down, laying out everything she knew, watching him cycle through his usual strategies of minimization and justification and blame. "No," she said. "I want the papers to speak for themselves. I want him to know I'm serious before he has a chance to rewrite the narrative." "Understood. I'll prepare the filing. You should think about where you're going to stay. I don't recommend remaining in the house once he knows." Cassidy had already thought about that. Emma had offered her guest room weeks ago, back when Cassidy had finally told her the full story of what was happening in her marriage. She'd been waiting for the right moment to accept. Apparently, this was it. That evening, while Joel worked late at the office, Cassidy packed. Not everything. Just enough for a few weeks. Clothes, toiletries, documents, the laptop she used for consulting work. She moved through the house she'd maintained for 17 years and felt strange distance from all of it. This had been her home, her life, the physical container for a marriage she'd believed was real. Now it was just a building full of furniture and accumulated objects. None of it meant anything without the story she'd built around it, and that story had been revealed as fiction. She left a note on the kitchen counter. Simple, direct, 3 sentences. "I know about the apartment. I know about the accounts. I've filed for divorce." Then Cassidy took her bags, walked out the front door, and drove to Emma's house across town. Joel called 47 minutes later. Cassidy was sitting in Emma's guest room, unpacking her hastily assembled life into temporary space, when her phone lit up with his name. She let it ring through to voicemail. He called again, then texted. "Cassidy, what is this? Call me. We need to talk." Then, 10 minutes later, "I don't understand what's happening. Please just talk to me." Then, an hour after that, "Whatever you think you know, you're misunderstanding. Let me explain." Cassidy read the messages with clinical detachment. Even now, even caught, Joel's instinct was to manage her perception, to reframe her understanding, to position himself as the reasonable one trying to clear up her confusion. She didn't respond. Emma knocked softly on the guest room door. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Cassidy said, and realized it was true. "I'm actually fine." The divorce papers were served 3 days later. Joel called Cassidy 17 times that day, left voicemails ranging from confused to angry to pleading. She listened to none of them. Margaret had advised no direct contact. Everything through attorneys now. Cleaner that way, less opportunity for Joel to manipulate or confuse or convince Cassidy to reconsider. But 2 weeks after moving out, Cassidy agreed to meet Joel in person. One conversation in a public place to set boundaries and make her position absolutely clear. They met at a coffee shop, neutral territory, late afternoon on a weekday. Joel was already there when Cassidy arrived. He looked terrible, exhausted, stressed, like he hadn't been sleeping. Part of Cassidy felt the old familiar pull to comfort him, to smooth over his distress, to make everything easier. She ignored that part. She sat down across from him and waited. "Cassidy," Joel said, and his voice broke slightly. "Please, just talk to me. Tell me what's happening." "You know what's happening. The apartment, I can explain that. It's not what you think." "What do I think, Joel?" He hesitated, clearly trying to gauge what she knew. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's probably worse than reality. The apartment is just a place I go sometimes when I need space. To think, to decompress. The job is stressful and I needed... For 4 years? It's complicated. Is there someone else?" Joel's expression shifted. Calculation behind his eyes, weighing what to admit. There was someone, briefly. It's over now. It didn't mean anything, Cassidy. It was just, I was going through something and I made a mistake, but it's you I love. It's always been you. Cassidy sat back and studied her husband. The man she'd built 17 years with. The man she'd edited herself to accommodate. The man who was, even now, feeding her partial truths calibrated to minimize damage and preserve his position. What about the bank account? She asked. Joel blinked. What bank account? The one you opened 6 years ago. The one with the monthly deposits I've never seen on our joint tax returns. He went very still. You went through my private financial records? You maintained a secret apartment and a hidden relationship. I think reviewing financial documents is reasonable under the circumstances. Joel's expression hardened. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by something colder. So you've been planning this, investigating, going behind my back to build a case against me. Yes? That's calculating, Cassidy. That's cold. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Joel had maintained a secret life for years, but 3 weeks of Cassidy gathering evidence was presented as betrayal. I want a divorce, Cassidy said calmly. That's not negotiable. We can do this cooperatively or we can do it contentiously, but either way, it's happening. Because of a mistake? Because I'm human and I struggled and I made a bad decision during a difficult period? Because our entire marriage has been a lie. That's not true. Joel, I don't even know who you are. The man I thought I married wouldn't maintain a secret apartment, wouldn't hide money, wouldn't have a relationship he describes as brief that required a 4-year lease on a 1-bedroom downtown. Every time I try to reconcile the husband I thought I knew with the evidence of who you actually are, nothing adds up. So either you've been lying to me for years or I've been so thoroughly gaslit that I can't trust my own perception of reality. Either way, I can't stay married to you. Joel's jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice had an edge. You're not thinking clearly. You're listening to bad advice from whoever you've been talking to, your attorney, your friends, whoever's putting these ideas in your head. This isn't you, Cassidy. You're not this vindictive. And there it was. The familiar pattern. Joel reframing Cassidy's clarity as confusion, suggesting she was being influenced rather than thinking independently, positioning her decision as emotional instability rather than rational choice. For 17 years, that strategy had worked. You're right, Cassidy said quietly. This isn't who I was when I was married to you. That's exactly why I'm leaving. She stood. The conversation was over. Joel reached across the table, caught her hand. Cassidy, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need. Just don't give up on us. Cassidy looked down at his hand on hers. Felt nothing. I'm not giving up on us, Joel. There is no us. There's you living your life however you choose and me finally doing the same. I'm sorry you're hurting, but I'm done making myself smaller to manage your emotions. She pulled her hand away gently and walked out of the coffee shop. Behind her, Joel called her name. She didn't turn around. The community fundraiser happened 3 weeks later. It was an event for one of Cassidy's nonprofit clients. Annual gala, major donors, community leaders. Emma had invited her, said it would be good for networking and Cassidy's consulting work. Cassidy almost declined when she realized Joel would likely be there. His company was a sponsor. He attended these kinds of events regularly for professional visibility, but then she thought, why should she avoid spaces because Joel might be present? This was her professional community too. She had as much right to be there as he did. So she went. Cassidy wore a dress that made her feel powerful. Navy blue, elegant, the kind of thing the consulting version of herself would have worn to client meetings. She'd lost weight over the past month, less from intention than from stress, and the simple fact that she'd stopped performing the domestic labor of elaborate meal preparation. But the effect was striking. She looked sharp, present, formidable. Emma picked her up, drove to the event venue. They walked in together and immediately were absorbed into conversation with other consultants and nonprofit directors. Cassidy moved through the crowd easily. This was familiar territory from her old professional life. She asked good questions, offered strategic insights, made people feel heard while also challenging their thinking. Several people asked for her card. A foundation director mentioned a major initiative that needed consulting support. She was in conversation with a group discussing capacity-building frameworks when she felt someone's attention. She glanced up. Joel was across the room staring at her. He looked shocked. Not just surprised to see her, but fundamentally disoriented, like he was seeing someone he didn't recognize. Cassidy understood why. The woman standing here engaged in animated professional conversation, laughing, gesturing, clearly respected and valued by the people around her. This wasn't the quiet, accommodating wife who'd existed in Joel's peripheral vision for 17 years. This was someone else. Someone competent and visible and complete. Joel started moving through the crowd toward her. Cassidy excused herself from her group and stepped aside. Not to a private corner, not out of sight, just to the edge of the main room, still visible to everyone present. A deliberate choice. Joel reached her, looking agitated. "Cassidy, I didn't know you'd be here. It's a community event. I'm part of the community. Can we talk, privately? We can talk here." Joel glanced around at the crowd, clearly uncomfortable. "I'd rather not have this conversation in public." "Then maybe we shouldn't have it." Joel lowered his voice. "Please, I miss you. I know I made mistakes, but I'm trying to fix them. I've ended everything else. It's just you I want. Can we at least try? Can you give me a chance to prove I can be better?" Cassidy looked at her husband. The man she'd devoted 17 years to. The man who'd waited until she'd left, until she'd filed for divorce, until his secret life had been exposed, to suddenly decide he wanted to work on their marriage. "Joel," she said quietly, "I don't want to repair what we had. What we had wasn't real." "That's not true. I spent 17 years making myself into the wife you needed. I edited out every part of myself that was inconvenient to your life. I made myself quiet, accommodating, endlessly patient. I let you convince me that my perceptions were wrong. My feelings were overreactions. My needs were unreasonable. I disappeared into the role you needed me to play. I never asked you to. You didn't have to ask. You just built a reality where that was the only way to exist in your orbit. And I chose to accommodate that reality because I thought that's what love required. But Joel, you were living an entirely separate life the whole time. You had energy and time and emotional availability. You just didn't choose to spend it with me. Every sacrifice I made was based on false information. Every time I made myself smaller to give you room, you were using that room for someone else." People nearby were starting to notice, not obviously eavesdropping, but aware that something significant was happening. Joel noticed too. His expression shifted, embarrassment mixing with anger. "You're making a scene." "No, I'm just telling the truth. For the first time in our marriage, I'm stating reality without softening it to make you comfortable. This isn't you talking. Someone's gotten in your head. Your attorney, your friends." "Stop," Cassidy said, and her voice was sharp enough that Joel actually went quiet. "Stop telling me who I am. Stop suggesting I'm not capable of thinking independently. Stop trying to convince me that clarity is confusion. I know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly who I am, and I know, with absolute certainty, that I don't want to be married to you anymore." "Cassidy, this isn't about punishing you. It's not even really about the apartment or the affair or the lying, though those things matter. It's about the fact that I spent 17 years trying to earn your attention, your recognition, your full presence, and you were never going to give me those things because you fundamentally don't see me. You see a role I was playing, but I'm not that role anymore. I'm a person. And that person is choosing to leave." Joel stared at her. For the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to have nothing to say. Cassidy felt something release in her chest. Some final tie to the marriage, to the version of herself who'd needed his approval, his validation, his version of reality to feel solid. She didn't need any of that anymore. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Cassidy said. "I genuinely do, but you're not going to find it with me. Because I'm done being what you need. I'm choosing what I need. And that's to be myself fully, without editing or apology or constant accommodation." She turned to walk away. Joel caught her arm. "Please, don't do this." Cassidy looked down at his hand, then up at his face. "Let go, Joel." He did. Slowly. And Cassidy walked back to her group, back to the conversation about strategic frameworks and organizational change. Back to the professional world where she was valued for her competence rather than her capacity to disappear. Behind her, she heard Joel leave. Heard the shift in room energy as people processed what they'd witnessed. Emma appeared at her elbow. "You okay?" "Yeah," Cassidy said. "I really am." And she was. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The settlement was fair. More than fair, actually, given the evidence of Joel's financial deception. Cassidy received enough to establish independent stability. The house was sold, assets divided. Margaret called to tell her it was official. After 17 years of marriage, Cassidy Brennan was single. She hung up the phone and sat in her new apartment. Small, bright, entirely hers. She'd furnished it with things she actually liked rather than things that matched some neutral aesthetic. Books everywhere. Art on the walls. Colors that made her happy. The consulting practice had grown. Emma had offered Cassidy a senior partnership in the firm. 3 major projects under her leadership. Clients who respected her expertise. Work that challenged and fulfilled her. Cassidy had reconnected with old friends. Made new ones. Started taking herself seriously again. She'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Joel was struggling. The divorce had damaged his carefully curated reputation. Some professional relationships had cooled once word spread about the secret apartment and hidden accounts. He was dating someone new already, which didn't surprise Cassidy. Joel needed someone to perform for. Someone to manage his life and reflect his preferred self-image. She felt something like pity for whoever that woman was. But it wasn't her problem anymore. One evening, Cassidy was walking home from a client dinner. The city was alive with early summer energy. People at outdoor cafes, street musicians, the particular quality of light that made everything feel possible. She passed the building that housed Joel's secret apartment, paused, looked up at the windows, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no curiosity about who might be there or what Joel's life looked like now. The apartment was just a building. Joel was just a man she used to know. And their marriage was just a chapter of her life that had ended so she could write the next one. Cassidy continued walking. Stopped at a small cafe she liked. Ordered tea. Sat by the window watching the city move around her. She pulled out her journal. The practice of writing had returned along with everything else she'd reclaimed. She wrote about the nonprofit project she was designing. The strategic challenges that excited her. The meeting next week with a potential new client. The weekend trip she was taking alone to the mountains because she wanted to and she could. Then she wrote something else. I spent 17 years afraid that without Joel's narrative, I would have no story at all. I was wrong. I am the story. I always was. Cassidy closed the journal, looked out at the city, her life, her choices. She was 45 years old, divorced, starting over, rebuilding from the ground up. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she was wholly, completely, undeniably herself, not Joel's wife, not the accommodating woman who edited herself to fit someone else's requirements, not the ghost of who she used to be, just Cassidy, strategic consultant, friend, woman learning to trust her own perceptions again, person choosing herself, finally, after years of choosing everyone else first. The victory wasn't in Joel's downfall, wasn't in revenge or public humiliation or watching him suffer consequences. The victory was in this moment. Sitting alone in a cafe she chose, doing work she loved, living in an apartment she'd furnished with things that made her happy, writing in a journal that reflected her actual thoughts instead of the edited version she'd spent years performing. The victory was sovereignty, self-authorship, the radical act of becoming real after years of being a character in someone else's story. Cassidy finished her tea, gathered her things, walked home through the warm evening. Tomorrow she had a client presentation. Next week, a consultation with a major foundation. Next month, a hiking trip she was taking alone because she enjoyed her own company. Her calendar was full of things she'd chosen. Her apartment was full of things she actually liked. Her work was full of challenges that engaged her completely, and her life, for the first time in 17 years, belonged entirely to her. That was the only crown worth wearing. The only victory that mattered. Cassidy unlocked her apartment door, stepped into the space she'd created, closed the door behind her, and smiled. Cassidy's story isn't just about betrayal. It's about something far more common and far more dangerous. The slow disappearance that happens when we love someone more than we love ourselves. Here's what 17 years taught her and what might serve you. Devotion without boundaries isn't love. It's self-erasure. When you edit yourself down to fit someone else's narrative, you don't become a better partner. You become a ghost in your own life. The people who truly love you don't need you to be smaller. They don't benefit from your silence. They don't require you to forget who you are to make room for who they need you to be. Real partnership amplifies both people. It creates space for two complete humans to exist fully, without one person perpetually accommodating the other into invisibility. And here's the truth that matters most. Reclaiming yourself isn't selfish. It's not cruel. It's not revenge. It's simply the choice to stop living in someone else's story and start writing your own. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need someone else's recognition to validate your worth. You don't need to wait until the conditions are perfect, or until you've suffered enough to justify choosing yourself. You just need the courage to remember who you were before you made yourself invisible, and the strength to become that person again. The question isn't whether you deserve better. You do. The question is whether you're brave enough to choose it, whether you're willing to risk the discomfort of being seen fully instead of the safety of being overlooked. Because here's what Cassidy learned. Being invisible feels safe. It avoids conflict. It keeps the peace. But it also slowly kills you. And at some point, you have to decide which is more frightening. The risk of being fully yourself or the certainty of disappearing completely. Cassidy chose herself. It cost her a marriage, but it gave her back her life. That trade, she discovered, was worth making. If Cassidy's journey meant something to you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you're working to reclaim your voice, or if you know someone who needs to hear that their story matters, subscribe to Silent Mind Stories. We're building a community of people who understand that strength isn't always loud, that wisdom often comes from silence, and that the most powerful victories are the ones where you simply choose yourself. Hit that subscribe button. Your story deserves to be heard, and you deserve to remember who you've always been. Thanks for listening. And remember, the most important story you'll ever tell is the one you live.